Africa holds 30% of the world's critical minerals. It captures less than 1% of the value of the technologies those minerals make possible. The United States cut health aid that was keeping 1.3 million HIV patients alive, then offered it back in exchange for cobalt. France powered its nuclear grid for 60 years on uranium bought for less than €1 per unit. Both countries call this partnership. The people living through it have other words. In January 2025, the United States government abruptly cut funding to USAID, the agency providing health assistance to some of the world's poorest countries. Researchers have since calculated that the funding cuts contributed to over 518,000 child deaths and 263,000 adult deaths from diseases that were entirely manageable with medication. HIV treatment for 1.3 million people in Zambia alone was disrupted. Within months of those cuts, American officials were back at the table in Harare and Lusaka with a new offer. We will restore some of the funding in exchange for your health data and access to your minerals. Zambia called the terms problematic. Zimbabwe walked away entirely. This is the story of what the richest countries on Earth actually do in Africa, not what they say they do. Let us begin with the numbers, because the numbers are more powerful than any editorial comment. Africa holds approximately 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves. The cobalt, lithium, coltan, copper, rare earths and uranium that power smartphones, electric vehicles, AI data centers and nuclear reactors across the developed world. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone holds over 70% of known global cobalt reserves, alongside vast deposits of coltan, the ore used in every smartphone on the planet. The continent's mineral wealth is not peripheral to the modern economy, it is foundational to it. And yet, Africa's share of the economic value generated from those minerals is approximately 10%. The World Economic Forum calculated in April 2026 that Africa captures less than 1% of the total value of the green technologies its minerals make possible. The continent extracts the raw materials. The profits from processing, manufacturing, and selling the final technologies accumulate elsewhere. This is not an accident. It is the architecture of a system that has been deliberately constructed and maintained across decades. The most recent and most explicitly documented case of this dynamic is the Democratic Republic of Congo. In February 2025, M23 rebels, widely reported to be backed by Rwanda, occupied the cities of Goma and Bukavu in eastern Congo, displacing millions of civilians. President Tshisekedi of the DRC wrote directly to President Trump, offering the United States access to the country's critical minerals in exchange for American security assistance to help end the conflict. Trump mediated a peace deal, the Washington Accords, formally signed in December 2025. The deal granted American companies preferential access to Congolese mineral concessions, including priority rights to future unlicensed deposits. The DRC's obligations were specific: preferential fiscal terms, regulatory reforms, privileged access for American firms. Washington's security commitments were described by analysts as vague, and by March 2026, the United States was imposing sanctions on Rwanda for violating the very peace it had just brokered. A group of DRC lawyers and human rights defenders brought the matter before the country's constitutional court. The lead campaigner said publicly, "No promises have been made on human rights. None. Human rights, justice, and environmental protection are the biggest blind spots in these agreements. The DRC holds an estimated $25 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. Over 90% of its mining potential remains unexploited. The race for those resources is not a future concern. It is happening now. The DRC is not an isolated case. In late 2025, the United States approached Zimbabwe with an offer of over $300 million in health funding, the same category of aid it had abruptly cut earlier that year, in exchange for sensitive health data and mineral access. Zimbabwe's government reviewed the terms, described the negotiations as lopsided, and walked away from the table entirely. Simultaneously, the US announced a potential $1 billion in funding for Zambia. Zambia reviewed the terms and identified what it called problematic clauses that sought access to the country's minerals. Zambia's mining sector represents 70% of its export revenues. The country relies on the US PEPFAR program for over 80% of its HIV funding, which provides free treatment for 1.3 million people, approximately 6% of the population. Lusaka was negotiating from a position of acute vulnerability, and Washington was offering restoration of the funding that was keeping people alive, with conditions attached. Ruben Silungwe, a Zambian development analyst, described the situation in direct terms. Linking such aid to payoffs in the extraction of critical minerals smacks of exploitative practices. He was not a radical commentator. He was a policy analyst describing what was documented in the negotiating papers. The pattern is consistent across cases. Withdraw aid that people depend on for survival, then reintroduce it as a conditional offer tied to resource access. The leverage is the gap between withdrawal and restoration. The American approach is explicit and recent. The French approach is older, more deeply embedded, and more difficult to see, though Africa has been seeing it clearly for decades. Niger is one of the poorest countries on Earth. According to the World Bank, nearly half its population lives below the poverty line. It has one of the world's lowest Human Development Index rankings. Inadequate electricity access, high malnutrition, severe poverty. It also sits on some of the world's largest uranium deposits. Uranium that powered over 70% of France's nuclear electricity needs for decades. Since 1971, the French firm Orano, formerly Areva, managed virtually the entirety of Niger's uranium mining industry. The arrangement, as documented by multiple researchers and now disputed in international arbitration, was as follows. France received uranium at prices critics describe as a fraction of international market rates, approximately 0.8 euros per unit, resold internationally at vastly higher prices. Niger's government has calculated this cost the state approximately 15 trillion CFA francs annually over the period of the arrangement. After the 2023 coup that removed a French-aligned government, Niger nationalized the Sommer uranium operation and revoked Orano's permit for the Imuraren deposit, the largest in the country. Niger is now demanding compensation for decades of what its government describes as systematic underpricing. France has not agreed to any compensation. The legal dispute continues. The poverty in Niger remains. Beyond uranium, The most structurally significant instrument of French economic control in Africa is the CFA franc. Created in 1945 under the name Colonie Française d'Afrique, the CFA franc is the common currency of 14 African countries across West and Central Africa. For decades, the countries using this currency were required to deposit half of their foreign exchange reserves with the French Treasury in Paris, not with their own central banks, with France. In return, France guaranteed the currency's convertibility to the euro. The reserve deposit requirement was formally reduced for the West African zone in 2020, a reform that African economists widely described as insufficient. The currency remains pegged to the euro, which means none of the 14 member states can devalue to make exports competitive, adjust interest rates to stimulate domestic investment, or develop monetary policy suited to their own economic cycles. Their monetary sovereignty belongs to a framework designed in Paris in 1945 and never fully returned. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have all formally announced plans to exit the CFA franc zone. When President Macron responded to African demands for French military withdrawal by publicly accusing former colonies of ingratitude in language described internationally as angry and condescending, the reaction across the continent accelerated the sovereignty movement he appeared to be trying to suppress. Within 3 years, France lost its military presence in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Senegal. What is new in 2026 is the organized, accelerating pushback. At least 13 African countries have enacted mineral export restrictions since 2023. Zimbabwe's export ban on raw lithium forced processing inside the country. China built a $400 million lithium processing plant at the Arcadia mine, the first of its kind in Africa, producing battery-grade material and keeping far more of the value inside Zimbabwe. The G20 Critical Minerals Framework, adopted at the 2025 Johannesburg Summit, explicitly reframed minerals from a Western supply security concern to a driver of African development. The African Union passed a Continental Critical Minerals Value Addition Framework in February 2026. These are not acts of anti-Western hostility. They are policy instruments: export levies, local processing requirements, equity participation mandates, designed to capture more of the value of the minerals that leave African soil. A 1 percentage point increase in Africa's share of the value of the green technologies its minerals enable would be worth more than the entire current foreign aid budget to the continent. The leverage exists. The question is whether it can be used before the contracts are signed. The capital is in the ground, and the balance of power has reversed again. The critical minerals race changes Africa's negotiating position for the first time since independence. Global demand for the minerals concentrated in African soil is projected to increase up to 5-fold by 2035. Every electric vehicle, every AI data center, every wind turbine, every solar panel requires materials disproportionately located in African countries. China understood this decades ago and built dominance in processing. The US is now scrambling to catch up. Europe is doing the same. For the first time, the countries that hold the minerals have structural leverage to demand that processing happens at home, that fiscal terms reflect actual market value, and that sovereignty is not bundled into the mining license. Whether that leverage is used effectively, or whether the financing gap, the debt dependency, and the security vulnerabilities that powerful states have cultivated for decades continue to constrain African governments, is the defining economic and political question of the next generation. The UNCTAD has confirmed a $225 billion investment shortfall in critical mineral processing in the Global South. That gap is not accidental. It is the structural mechanism that keeps African countries at the extraction end of the supply chain, selling raw ore at the bottom of the value curve, while the profits from processing and manufacturing accumulate in the countries that engineered the gap in the first place. Africa captures less than 1% of the value of the technologies built from its minerals. The documented mechanism, underpriced uranium, aid for mineral deals, a currency requiring reserves to be parked in Paris, peace agreements that prioritize cobalt access over human rights protections, is in the contracts, the legal filings, the published research of international institutions, and the public statements of the people living through it. The countries extracting this wealth call their approach partnership and investment. The countries whose minerals leave and whose poverty stays have begun, finally, to use a different word: sovereignty. Subscribe if you want to think like the top 1%, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of understanding. The people who read the contracts rather than the press releases, and who know the difference between a partnership and an extraction.